little things here that are some tips and tricks and just what I consider best practice in building GoldSim models. I see them as programs, but they're more than just programming because you can add so much other stuff to it. For example, illustrations. I'm big on making models usable and readable, almost like a document that has math in it and has illustrations and stuff in it. So just put together some examples here. This one's pretty simple. It's stolen from the dimensions are from engineering drawings. In fact, what I didn't do in this example is have the engineering drawing actually thrown in right behind this, and so you can see the original drawing. I took it out because it was kind of busy, but I have done that before. In fact, that's a nice way to make your drawing, is if you have something you're trying to emulate with the nice little drawing tools here in GoldSim, get a bitmap of it, throw it on the page and draw on top of that, and then get rid of the bitmap. Then you know at least it's close to being correct. The drawing tools, for those who aren't familiar with them, live over here. There's actually not a lot of them, but it's kind of surprising what you can do with what is here. These are all done with the native drawing tools, except for the occasional photograph or something thrown in. Now, what's useful about something like this example is you could just have these inputs into the model: length overall, length to break, width to break, ridge length, things like that. But it would require a lot of explanation to say exactly what it was, where it came from. But with the drawing, it's obvious what the different things are. And some would be a dimension pulled off a drawing, like length overall here of 1,430 feet. But then others are derived from those. So here you can take width overall divided by 2, minus something else, and then you can derive some of them in here. That way you're sure they add up to the right numbers. So some are pulled off the drawing and some are calculated from what else is given here, but it's all made to be fairly clear as to what things are. Here's another. So I'm going to go through basically some engineering type drawings and then some other illustrations too. So here's an elevation. Here it was nice to throw in a photograph of the place. This is actually a RCRA landfill. See all this junk in here. And then here is a cross-sectional drawing of it that has the dimensions and things from the drawing. And here to try to make it to scale, I put in a little scale block. And again, this is all done just with the drawing tools. And it's kind of neat to see the photograph and the thing with it, because then you can start. I mean, it's easier to imagine what you're seeing. I don't know, I'm a visual person, so this sort of thing helps me a lot. Another elevation drawing is like a section through a liner. One of the cells in that RCRA landfill. It looks kind of boat-shaped cell here, and then here's what the liner looks like, and this is all pulled into the model in various ways because this is part of the calculations. Work with the liner dimensions and that sort of stuff, and we have to get the whole volume of the place. So the volume is a calculation based on these other dimensions, and volume is not on the engineering drawing, but all the other dimensions are, so you can kind of combine all that and get what you need for your model. There's another sort of specialized calculation. The volume of this weird hip-shaped roof piece, and so here's a drawing of it and the different sections, and then a description, and then the calculations for each piece of it, and then they all get summed together here in a summation element. And then we come up with an average thickness, because actually this gets turned, this complicated shape gets turned into a flat pancake that has the same volume. So we can make 1D models which run much faster than more fancy ones. Here's a sort of an orthographic projection of the same thing, actually, showing how water would move through the system, just to help the user conceptualize what's going on. And saturated zone compartments, it's a compartment model with a bunch of cells, and these are a bunch of cells coming down. So water drips down and then hits the water table, the saturated zone, and by clever use of different colored lines and sort of faded blue and stuff like that, you can almost make it look like it has some transparency to it. And monitoring well hidden down behind there. So this is where you can order things very carefully. You know, when you pick something, there's this ordering tool. Do you send it to the front, to the back? And so you can take all your polygons and order them and that sort of thing. Something I mentioned this morning was there's one drawback with the drawing tools. I have to ungroup all these things, several layers of groups here, but if I get down to the last group, you can see this, for example, this sort of pale green thing. It's actually a weird shaped polygon that I had to put in there to make it fit. The drawback with the drawing tools is, although you can draw this very carefully, if you mess it up, you have to completely start over, because you can edit it with stretching, but you can't edit the position of the corner points. So that's just something that would be nice to have someday. Put that on the list of enhancements. But even with that, if you're careful, you can do an awful lot with the drawings. And then they're right there in the model, which is handy. And then if you're writing a document to go along with it, you can just take this and copy it out and stick it right in the document. So actually using GoldSim as the drawing tool, it can be handy. Oh, okay, this is a fun one. So decay chains. Those of you who have dealt with radiological stuff.
Hey, John.
Species element. Yeah.
John, sorry to interrupt,
yeah.
but on that last page you were on.
Yep.
Yeah, another, or any of these drawing pages. Just a note. One other option here is you could use the drawing tools of a Microsoft Office tool like PowerPoint, which is a bit more rich than this one. And then you can right click on once you get the drawing, and then you combine it all into group it. You can right click and select save as an image. And one of the options in there is a enhanced metafile, which probably people aren't very familiar with, but it's EMF or even WMF. And those come in very nicely, similar to what you see here. You can scale it and so forth. Like it's got like a vector drawing, kind of like this one.
Right.
And once you bring it in using the insert image command in GoldSim. So it's just another option to drawing. You know, rather than just having like a JPEG that goes in, you could have one not as great because it's not native, right, in GoldSim, but just another option. So I just thought I'd mention that.
You can't then edit it in GoldSim, can you?
No. Yeah, that's the downside.
Yeah, you can bring in all kinds of images into GoldSim, and there are certain cases where it makes much more sense to use something else. I have some examples there too, like a fancy equation. You want to format that with an equation editor, and then take a picture of it or get a metafile of it and bring that in. Yeah, that's true.
Right, and I was just mentioning that because it could be a vector. A vector drawing would be nice because you can scale it. It looks nice when you scale it versus raster image. Yeah. Okay. Good. Anyway, thanks.
So if you've messed with species, then you know that the species element, although it has all the connections and decay chains and all that kind of stuff in it, it's kind of hard just by looking at it to see what all's going on. And so I started doing this in our models that have radiological stuff, is introduce all the different species that are being modeled, the different radionuclides and their decay chains, and these are all the simple ones. And then there are more difficult ones, like the uranium series, for example. It's actually pretty complicated how it works, and you're not going to see all this just by looking at the species element. So it just helps communicate things, and it's good for QA too, because this shows actual values. Now, well, yeah, I don't know. In a way, it doesn't show the actual values. This is another thing that would be handy is here's a number, 0.9984, but it's just a piece of text thrown into the drawing here. What would be way cool is if that number could be linked to an output from any GoldSim element, and then you could put stuff on the drawing, and since it's linked to the output, that would be a real positive QA thing. Right now, that number also exists in the model, just like the topology of all this exists in the species element. That really does have to kind of be QA'd by hand, but to have the numbers would be kind of cool. But at any rate, this is a nice way of communicating what's going on. And I'm using different colors to show elements or radionuclides that are modeled, like in black, and then things that actually aren't modeled explicitly, but only in the dose equations. They're green, and then there's explanation at the top about all those different things. But there's another example of an illustration.
Hey, John. John,
Yeah.
sorry to interrupt again. On that image, could you possibly use a dashboard to display those output values that you're talking about, wanting to see those outputs when you run the simulation?
That would be interesting. I suppose you could build this whole thing in a dashboard.
You'd have to draw all those
Now I
arrows.
got to try that. Yeah, you still got to draw the arrows, and you got to put in the names, because the numbers though could be, yeah, that could be part of a dashboard. Good idea.
And you could
Oh,
have
there.
you now also have the text display, so you could display text that might be changing, dynamically too, and the
Right.
values. Yeah. So
Yeah.
anyway,
Greek characters might be an issue.
yep.
Still
Yep.
waiting for GoldSim to go to Unicode. Once you go to Unicode, we can put in all kinds of stuff like half signs and yeah.
Right.
So here's another illustration just of some processing, of some physical processes that go on. This one happens to do with plants. It might have roots that get down into some waste zone down here, and then there's what starts out as a clean cap above, and plants uptake stuff, and then they die off, and when they die, they put the contaminants back in the soil and all this, and this is actually a process that we model a lot. And then you can have an explanation over here. These text boxes are very handy. They're really quite flexible, like little word processors in there on their own right, and you can put all kinds of nifty stuff in there and keep it in a compact space. So I like the text boxes. Here's another more involved illustration. This is from a decision model that we wrote to help with some radioactive waste disposition problems that the government had. What are we going to do with this stuff? Where do we dispose it? They could make decisions about putting it on site, taking it off site. It's going to need characterization, or maybe you leave it in place. And what does it impact cost? Are there time, worker dose, public risk, all these different aspects to each of these decision boxes. And so this illustrates the logic that's going on in the model. Hopefully you get down to this point where you make a decision, either you're disposing off-site or on-site. But the model takes you through all that, and then what's neat is you can put in hyperlinks to different parts of the model. So if you want to go see what waste removal is about, you can go there and see what calculations are done behind that part of the model. And it's run probabilistically, where each decision is both made and not made, or it's made one way or the other at the same time, and then you can see what happens as you run these different scenarios. So this was written before 11, GoldSim 11. Now doing scenarios, you could implement that as different decision scenarios, which would be a neat thing to do. But the point here is using the illustration to help communicate organization of the model. Another one related to contaminant transport is exposure pathways, and this is also something that you kind of need to have in one place so people can see what's going on in the model. Here maybe you have some buried wastes over here, you're curious about how they actually make their way out into the environment and could be ultimately in exposure media that people and animals and plants, other animals and plants could be exposed to. And this just illustrates all the pathways that are connections in the model for having, in this case, radionuclides moving around in the model. And again, it has these little hyperlinks in here. So it's kind of fun to throw hyperlinks into the drawing, because then they become almost an index for the model, and you can use it to navigate around.
Hey, John. Hey, John.
And then one other thing, I expect a lot. Yeah.
Oh, back on the hyperlinks. Maybe you do this. One thing I've seen people do is you can change the hyperlink to be text only or image only. If you don't like to see the little word there, and all you want to see is just the text with the the blue and the underline is another possibility, or just
right.
have an image too. But anyway, just thought I'd throw that in there.
And you can even make up images. So you could make an image to, you can have a picture of an animal there, and then you could click on that and it would take you to another part of the model.
Yeah, good point.
Yeah. Depends how much time you have in your budget to make the model pretty.
Right.
One other thing I expect people that are modeling events would find useful is this, just sort of a thing I came up with. There are these different events that you got status elements that happen. They will click on at different times in the model. And it's kind of useful to throw them on a graph here. So this is a graph through time from left to right. And you can see when you might expect things to kick in or turn off. And then you could even have a result element here that shows the status of these things. And then you can watch stochastically, or however you want to see it, and see things change in the model through time. And it's just another way of organizing information and presenting it using the drawing tools with, in this case, elements stuck on top of it. So those are some sample illustrations. They're all part of documentation, but we always include a special documentation container in our models too, and it has stuff, sort of meta information about the model. The change log, for example. GoldSim is it's a programming language, is sort of how I see it, and so from the programming world, I bring the concept of change logs, and I think every model ought to have something like this that shows when you made changes, what version it was, if you are versioning your model, and date and who did it and what the change was, so that when you're looking at it later and you can say, something weird happened there between version 1 and 2. What was it? What changes did we make? And you can go back and have some hope of finding that out. There are other ways of tracking that, and I'll get into those in the QA bit in a little bit here. Other documentation can be useful is technical explanations of stuff. Here's an example of a rather complicated-looking formula, the Muldrup et al. Air phase tortuosity calculation. And it has these inputs and then uses these equations. And the equations were done in equation editor and then just copied and pasted in here as graphic figures. And then there's a lot of explanation about using Van Genuchten's parameters for porous media, unsaturated flow, blah, blah, blah. And then here's a nice example of using a text box with a lot of the other features that it has. Using different fonts, and here you can use Greek characters and fonts like, italicized or whatever. You can actually have your equations in here. You can have an equation, if you can put it on one line, it works out pretty well. Otherwise, you kind of need to do a graphic like over here. And here we go through the explanation of what's going on behind all this and how it fits in, and then here are the references too. So that's a nice use of the text box. Speaking of references, something else we like to do is put in references to things in the model. And this is just basically a big long list of all the references in one of our models. And some are, you might say, distributable, like public information. And so you can give them the PDF, and you can see it says open references to, there's a PDF in there called 10 CFR 61. So when we provide a model, we often will have a references directory with it, and these point to that references directory. And then you can just immediately bring up the PDF that someone's interested in. And you can scatter these around in the model too. So if someone's looking at that Muldrup reference, we could have a reference right in there that takes them to the paper. Now some things are not distributable, they're copyrighted papers. So in that case, you could provide a link to where someone could find it out on the web, the publisher, something like that. Here's Wiley.com, and here's Amazon as a last resort for some of them. So then people can get a hold of all the references in your model. Another example here, the decision layout. Well, yeah, I just sort of clipped this out of a model that we had put together. Now, GoldSim has all the arrows that work between elements, but I kind of like to invent my own a lot of the time. You know, there's nothing that puts stuff together like this, and this is just to help show the flow of logic in the model, this or this, and then what's the, you know, is the disposition complete, blah, blah, blah. This was out of that decision model I was showing you the flow chart for earlier. And again, there's you know, text box explaining things. So that's part of the documentation. And documentation is in here for quality assurance. And quality assurance, I know it's kind of a pain sometimes, but it's really necessary because if you don't have QA, then you can't really trust the answers you're getting out of your model, and why are you doing it anyway at that point? If you've got someone who's willing to pay you a bunch of money to build a model, then they ought to be willing to pay a little more money, or maybe a bunch more money, to get the quality assurance right, so that they have faith in the model. So there are a lot of tools built into GoldSim for doing QA, and we use them all the time. For example, the note pane. Here's a simple data element with a number in it. If we look at the note pane, in here you can see the model I stole that from. It says that apparently it was me back in 2011 who checked this value against its source and put in the number and all that, so I only have to trust that I knew what I was doing back then. And there's a note note in there that is sort of it's a positive link back to QA, and so that's really simple, the note pane. Then there's stuff like versioning, and not sure how many people really use versioning. Once we get into a production model that is having releases with, you know, once the QA is done and it's ready to use for decision making or modeling, then definitely want to get a version stamp on there. In part for your own protection, if you're passing this on to some client and they want to go in and start making changes to the model, it's all recorded. So if they say, hey, you know, we're seeing this, and you can say, well, that's because you messed with the model. It's not the way it's not the way it was when we gave it to you. So versioning can be very handy. You can log your versions at any time during the development process. Here you have different releases, and then you know, as we go through different versions of GoldSim, we reversion the model, and you can generate reports. And each element that gets changed will have version change notes with it, and you can enter in stuff sort of like the note pane. You can enter in things in a version change note, and it says what happened when you did that. And then here is a list of what happened to an element here called upper radon barrier KSAT as built since a certain version number, and you can see all the things that happened. Its name was changed, it got moved to a different location, and then here is the version change note left by one of our GoldSim modelers, Kate Catlett, who changed this back in May of 2014, and she left a note about what she did. So with all these tools, you can really keep a very positive record of everything that happened in your model. Handy stuff. So those are the built-in tools, and then there are other things that we do and we recommend.
John,
Yes.
excuse me, this is Rick. I have a question for you that you should, it might be interesting to share with the group. In order to do this, do you guys have some like written procedures that this is what a modeler in your organization does when they edit, when they build a model, or is it just kind of, how does a new modeler learn?
That's a good point. Yeah, that's a good question. We do have a GoldSim modeling QA plan. And so, yes, we have a procedure that is written, and as people start applying their GoldSim skills to actual models that we produce for clients, then, well, actually, even when they're messing around, I'd like them to start getting in the habit of doing all this stuff right away. So, yeah, we even get into as far as how to name your files and how to incorporate version numbers into names in a way that is very positive, and how to do chain of custody on the model. That's actually something I hadn't mentioned here, is at all times you have to know which is the model. And with GoldSim, unlike codes that you would write in text like Java or C or something like that, we have different people working on different parts of the code and then combine it all and that sort of thing. That can be done to a limited extent here, but basically there is one model that is always the current model, and that current model always has a custodian. So there's always a person, one of our staff, who is in charge of that model at any given time. And we usually write that name right at the top level of the model. So yeah, we do have procedures for how we do all this. And the idea is to make them consistent and to make sure that the QA is in place. The downside of writing a procedure is if you don't follow it, then that's worse than not having written it at all. So if you're going to write a procedure, you better be ready to follow it. So something else that we have done in some models is to do QA exercise. Here I left a change note here that said I did the QA exercises on this model back in 2006. This is an old one. And in here, there's a description of how to go about checking these things, and then you can run the model and check result elements here to look at the results as you switch switches on the dashboard, because the switches will make the model do different things. And then you can check these outputs and these result elements to see that the switches are doing what we say they're doing and that sort of stuff. So you can build this kind of testing right into the model, which is very handy because it comes time for the next release. You want to go through this process, and you already have it all documented, written down, and you can write your results down here as you go through, and then there's a permanent record of that as part of the model. So that can be very handy. Another thing, if you're writing production models for people, is to build a release checklist. And I just noticed something in here. I've got that line's a little too long. So you have a release checklist that takes you through all the things you need to do before you release the version of the model. You know, you want to have things set a certain way and all that. And I'm sure that the GoldSim guys have much more extensive checklists than this every time they release something out of GoldSim. I'm sure there's QA tests and all this stuff. You just don't get to see it. But since these are models that we're building for people and they're paying for them, then I think it's fair to include all this stuff because QA wonks are going to want to see that sort of thing. So that's all part of quality assurance and documentation and illustrations. And those are things that I rarely see in any models, but I just can't say strongly enough how important they are. Okay, now I'm going to get into some of the trickier things. Not sure how many people on the phone do rad performance assessment or rad waste work, but I'm just going to use these examples and like I said before, see if you can adapt them for what you do. Here's a species element, and as I was saying before, you can look at the species element, which alas I can't make that window taller, so you get to scroll through the whole thing. But you can have a species element, and you look at that, and it says, oh, this decays to that, and then that decays to nothing, and then this decays, you know, and it's hard to see what's going on, which is why we did the drawing of this whole thing. And you'll notice something funny about this, which I'm going to get into in a minute, is look, it's cloned. And I'll explain why anybody would ever be interested in cloning a species element or a solid material in a minute. Then here's a little trick, is the species element refers to half-lives as items in a half-lives array. And if you look at the half-lives array, it's arrayed by species. Well, so we have a little chicken and egg problem here. And took a while to figure out how to build that, because if you're going to build this, you can't refer to half-lives because it doesn't exist yet, because it has to be dimensioned by that. So I'll let you figure out how. Well, the way you do it is you just build in some dummy number half-lives first. And then once you've got your species list done, then you can build the half-lives element. You go back and you have to edit that back. But the reason that we bother doing that, you might say, well, that sounds like a lot of trouble for no good. Why not just punch the numbers in? Well, in any case that I can in GoldSim, I will not hard code numbers into any entries. Here for weight, you have to. I expect it's on our list to for enhancements, that someday one could have that linked as well. Half-lives are here linked out there, and the reason it's nice is for QA, because now I can have all the half-lives here, and I can take that list and bring it in from a spreadsheet somewhere or something like that. Now, the species element, of course, has its own specialized interface to spreadsheets too, but this way it's easier to keep track of things, and I like QAing whole vectors rather than going in here and looking at individual numbers.
Hey, John, I would note,
yeah,
you're not using any of the database that's built in to the species element here. These are all custom,
That's
right?
correct. That's correct.
Right.
And I know that Ian had put a lot of time and effort, all you guys had, into building in a database, a half-life.
Yep.
And the reason I don't use that is every client has their own favorite source for information. Some like the chart of the nuclides, some like Thule's tables, some like NRC's RAD toolbox, and they all actually have, well, in a surprising number of cases, they're slightly different numbers. Not that they would really make any difference in the thing. And then there's certain custom features, like I'll show this later, how we handle a tricky decay of radium to lead-210 or to radon-222 to handle something known as radon emanation factor. And so when you have to do specialized things like that, then also I had started building these since before that change. And so in a way, it's old habits and old sets of data that I already have in place. So, but it is true, if you go look in the documentation for GoldSim, there are instructions on how to automate a good bit of this. If you're not particular about that half-lives must come from a particular source or something like that, the database that's already in GoldSim can save you an awful lot of time. Because building this can be quite tedious. Actually, researching all the data is the tedious part. So I'll come back to why that's cloned in a little bit, but you remember, here's the species, the decay chains illustration. And this has to get, of course, QA'd by hand against your list and other stuff. But once it's there, then you can leave a little change note that says that it's taken care of. Okay, so materials. Again, in these elements, you could punch in a number, but I would say, why would you do that? It's much better to punch in a link to something that could be output from a data element, a stochastic, an expression. We use all of those things to generate information that goes in here, and we might switch them out, and then we don't have to come in and edit this. We just go in and edit bulk density sand. That more than one thing, more than one material might be pointing to as well. So the only number I hard code in here is tortuosity is 1, and if you're interested why we don't use tortuosity in here either, it's because it's not just a property of the solid material if you have unsaturated materials. And things get really complicated. And anybody who's interested in how we model unsaturated zone flow, you can contact me later and I'll tell you all about it. Again, the KDs. And I'm going to show you, because of this cloned element, why having a word in here, having a link to an element output, makes more sense than having a bunch of numbers coded in. And so where do those numbers come from? They're hiding here in material properties, sand, the ones for sand. And here, these all happen to be data elements, but in many cases, you would have functions. Here's some functions down here. For saturation with respect to air content, the numbers that go into the mole drip calculation, the tortuosity, and all that kind of stuff. So they're all in here too. And the only two that are directly referenced here are for porosity and bulk density, and the others are functions of those, but are used elsewhere. And if I had a number punched in there, then these things that are functions of those would have to, well, they could pull the number off the solid. That's true. But for various reasons, QA being one of them, we like having data elements out on their own. Clay, same way. It's referring to specific things for clay that live over in here, and that looks very much like it. Same for water and air. They point to water properties and air properties. Water, I'm not sure how many folks on the phone care about this, the diffusivity thing. And I must confess, I've never really understood why GoldSim uses a reference diffusivity and a relative diffusivity. It just seems confusing to me. So what I do is I set the reference diffusivity to one unit diffusivity, and then have an actual diffusivity. Here's the molecular diffusivity for all the different elements. Well, it's 1 that's used for all the different elements. And then I reference that and then divide by the reference diffusivity to make that go away. So if people are interested in why that happens, we could have a discussion about that. Same for air, there's a reference diffusivity. And then here we're referencing air-water partition coefficients. And they're all here in air properties too. So here's kind of a fun thing. I'm going to talk more about this later, but if you are looking at an array of coefficients or array of anything that is built up from different items, then you want to build those into an array. So here we only actually had 2 different items because only 2 of these chemicals, 2 of these elements actually are volatile. And the others are 0, but they get collected into an element and then referenced out from there. And I see I'm running a little slower this time than I was this morning, so I'm going to try to speed things up. Cell columns. I'll go through this quickly, and if people are interested, there was a question about it this morning as to why anybody would do this, but when we're doing contaminant transport, we like to use columns of cells rather than pipes or aquifer elements or even cell nets. In part because the pipe and aquifer elements don't support diffusion or direct transfer rates like what animals and plants might be moving things around. And the cell net generators have the problem of requiring the hard code numbers into them. So we use cells, and sometimes it's a matter of how many cells do we want to use. And we can build a column that has maybe 10 cells in it. And I'm going to show you what these other things do too. Or a column that might have 100 cells in it. This is actually part of a model we're working on to determine how many cells you need in your model. These cells are all connected, one on top of the next. And then there's even a 1,000-cell one that I'll show you next. What's in here is, these are all clones, the height of each cell, the volume of each cell, because the equation doesn't change. The only thing that changes is the number of cells. Everything else is tied to that. And then here's a little trick also I want to show you, is this material is referenced inside all the cells, okay? So each cell has the material is called local material. Now what is that material? Is it clay? Is it sand? What is it? Well, it's all pointing to this local material, and this one happens to be a clone of sand. You can see the clones. There it is as sand. If I want to just change all the materials in all these cells instantly to clay without editing all the cells, which would be a real pain, I can delete this, go out to clay, have it clone a version of clay here, and rename the clone local material, and all of those cells will see it again and connect it, and now it's clay. So that's a pretty cool use of cloned elements and of seeing stuff localized. All of this is in this localized container. One other quick thing I want to show you is building these columns would be very tedious. See, once you build 10, then you can make 10 copies and stitch them together end to end and make 100. And you have to rename the cells. Now, if you're going to make 1,000, yeah, you could stitch them end to end together, but then you have to rename all of them. So another way to do it is start with 1,000. Start with a box of 100, a localized container of 100, and you see it has cells numbered 0 through 99 in it, and then have another box that has exactly the same inside, but since they're localized, you can use the same innards. So now I just copy this 10 times and take the top of this one to the bottom of that one, the top of this to the bottom of that, stitch them together, and all of a sudden I have a column of 1,000 cells. And it only took me 10 minutes instead of, if I had to build it by hand, it would take hours, a whole day easy. Moving on. Oh, and all of these do share some of these common things too. So you can put common stuff out here, and it's a way of using the localization and the scope that each cell can see. Dashboards. Dashboards are a lot of fun. I've been having a good time with dashboards. Here's one that is just outputs. These are all, it's just a table of all kinds of results from around the model. This is that decision model again. We're trying to figure out what to do with the waste. And the headings here double as buttons. So you can go to that part of the model and go look at shipping costs or whatever. And then this is good for decision makers, because now here they can run different scenarios and see what is the cost or the total collective dose or the highest individual dose. And then they can see what path it took to get there and that sort of stuff. So that's just, it's kind of basic, just output stuff. Now we have a control panel here that's much busier, I would say compact, and colorful. And this has all sorts of interesting controls in it, like there are input boxes, there are check boxes. Here are check boxes, and as you check each one, it changes the area that is of concern, and since there's the thickness to it, then the volume changes too. And so you can decide how many cells you want to model, and then you come down here, here's instructions on how to determine waste limits, basically. And then there's all these different decay chains. And to keep the decay chain straight, I've colored them different colors. Then there's this interesting iterative calculation that has to be done. I couldn't figure out any way around it except to actually talk the user through how to do this iterative calculation. So there are instructions: run it, copy the vector. You hit that button, it brings up the vector to copy. Enter edit mode, paste the vector over here, rerun the model, and then here's a tolerance for error. It's a convergent iterative solution. And once you're there, then this yellow exclamation mark turns into a thumbs up. And so you can do the iteration until you're happy with the result. So this is an example of a fairly complex control panel, and then it also has associated results. And you can see the colors here again. So the purple is from the thorium series, the orange ones are from the uranium series. And there's a lot of information packed into here, and there's actually, you know, hundreds of outputs just on this one page. And this is one of 7 pages. There's so many radionuclides in this model that we had to divide this up into 7 pages. They all look like this. They all have different radionuclides on them. And then you can see what the concentration of what you put in was, what the dose came out, and then here is the receptor that is limiting the dose. It could be the farmer, a hunter, a recreationalist, an oil field worker. That's very useful information for decision makers to know. And then there's another panel where you can go see, well, okay, the dose to the oil field worker, what pathway did it come from? Did it come from breathing dust? Did it come from shine? Did it come, you know, what pathway did it, and what radionuclide was the strongest one? So there's all kinds of information that you can pack into your dashboards. A few little miscellaneous things. Oh yeah, here's one. So this one's more general in application. Let's say you have a list of numbers, and they're in an indexed array. Now, it could be days of the week, it could be fruit, whatever you like. And you want to get a number out of this list that is in, let's say, for neptunium. Well, if I'm going to do a row lookup, I have to know that neptunium is item number 5 in the list. Well, that's kind of inconvenient, but you can do that. And so I could say get item from KD values, item number 5, and I know that that's neptunium. The one problem with this is, what if I change the list and I add another element up there, another item in the list? Now it's no longer 5, now it's 6. And I have to go hunt around the model and find everywhere I'd called it 5, now it has to be 6. That's just inviting error, and it's not convenient. But here's a nifty workaround. You can build an index for that. So we have an array called elements, and using this structure, what we get out of this is the number that is the index for each of those elements. So I go to look at neptunium, and it's number 5. And this will always work. And if I add another item up here, then neptunium gets stepped down to 6. But that just happens naturally. So that's nice. And now, if I want to know the item for neptunium from KD values, then instead of the number 5, I put in element index of neptunium. And it will find number 5. It'll find the right number. So that's a handy trick for people.
John, I got a question there. Why wouldn't you just say KD value bracket neptunium?
Oh, well, you could, yes, you could do that too. Maybe this wasn't a good example. There's some examples where that doesn't work well. And I'm not thinking of one off the top of my head, but I did have to invent this little system.
It might work better if you were, where it would come in handy if you were to do this for a matrix and you get a row out of a matrix.
Yes, right.
Right. It could come in handy. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, the matrix would be. That's a good question. Yeah, you just punched a hole through the whole argument. But this is still useful. Then another one is I kind of hinted at this before. If you're collecting data into an array that you want to have so that you can manipulate it, but let's say the data going into it come from all kinds of different things. Here's an example of KD's, soil water partition coefficients. And when we're working at a site, in this case it was Nevada National Security, Nevada National Security Site, they call it now. It used to be Nevada Test Site. What you want to do is work with site-specific data if it's available. If you don't have that, then look for some paper at a analog site or something. And if you don't have that, then end up going out into the literature and then get other things. So we try to order stuff that way, and it turns out there was a paper with some KD values for these 6 elements and gave distributions too, which was great. So those are brought in as stochastics, and each one could be its own type, maybe normal, maybe log normal, whatever. And then there are a couple where, well, we know the KD for iodine is about 0. So we're just going to leave it at 0. There's no uncertainty. Then there's another source we found that had KDs for lead and radium. And another one, and there's Trier et al., where they said, well, actinium really behaves a lot like americium, so just make it whatever americium is. And protactinium is a lot like neptunium, so just make it whatever that is. So here we've got stochastics, data elements, expressions, all these different things, and we want to get them all put into this array. Well, so we build an array that's the data element that isn't really an input data element. Data element where each line in it is actually a reference to an expression, or it could be a whole equation. In fact, sometimes they're rather complicated equations that go in here. And then this is all inside a localized container so that I can use these names in other places too. And then this is the only thing that gets exported outside the container. So all that KD expression is just conveniently held in here. And let's see. Oh, yeah, I could localize this and then expose that out of it. And if you haven't used aliases and exposed elements for exposed elements, I highly recommend it. There are times when it really is critical to keep things straight, because you might have similar element names, output names, exposed from different localized containers, and that's when you really want to use the alias to keep them straight. About out of time. I'm certainly happy to entertain any questions, and since I went longer this time, I don't really have time, unless people want to stick around, for showing something I was working on today, some other little dashboard magic. But I'm done here with this presentation, and if anybody has any questions, I'm certainly open to hear them. And if anybody wants to stick around for just a couple minutes, I'll show you a cool dashboard application.
Hey, John, this is Jason. I don't see any questions at the moment, but nobody has left. Everybody looks like they're sticking around, so we might as well just keep going.
I'm gonna move the focus over to let's see, to a different GoldSim application. Here we go. Okay, this is a model we're working on to calibrate diffusion and decide how many cells you need in a diffusive column. But the magic thing I wanted to show you is over here. Here we're defining material properties for 2 different parts in the column. There's the column, and then at the bottom is a source. We have material properties like dry bulk density and porosity that are used in a definition of a solid, and then other things that matter for diffusion like water content, residual water content, Van Genupten parameters, all this kind of stuff. Now, we have it here where if you want to use the deterministic values, you can use these in the dashboard, and you can go in and change these numbers for the column or for the source. Maybe you decide, okay, I want the same material to be in both, but I don't want to have to edit all these numbers. I have a little checkbox here that says, okay, the source now is using all the numbers from this column instead of defining its own. So there's a little checkbox with an equal sign to make column equal to, or make source equal to column. All right. You turn that off and you can edit them independently, turn it on, and they are the same as those numbers. Now the cool dashboard magic is that the other entries disappeared and is replaced with display of numbers instead of entry of numbers. Now it gets even more fun if you want to use stochastic values, because we can't enter the stochastics in like this. So if you want to enter in the stochastics, you go here and you go edit each stochastic element. And also, if you want to make the ones here equal to the ones here, you can still check the box and it will make them equal to that. Or you can edit them independently, or you can go back to the values that you had entered on the dashboard in the first place. So I will leave it to the user to figure out how I did all that. But actually what happens is these are linked. It's using the attributes. You can make controls disappear. Oh, actually, what I clicked on is not what it looks like I clicked on. What I clicked on is the hidden one behind there. So this on the front disappears if there's a switch in there called override source material entry. And override source material entry is true if this box is clicked, or if we are using stochastics, and then this entry box disappears and this box, which is hidden behind it, appears. So you can hide things behind each other in layers in the dashboard. You can see there's the one behind, and then here's the one in front. So the dashboards can actually do some fun and tricky stuff like that. And now to hide it nicely, you want to get them all aligned. Now you don't even see them. But if you turn that on, then you can make those disappear or make the whole thing disappear. And all of that is done with some fancy switches and selectors in the background that are tied to things like this and which one this is, which is set to. So you can have it then interactively switch things and hide things depending on the user's choice of certain things.
John, can you just quickly show the attributes page for one of those controls to kind of give them a...
Yeah. Okay, so I got to get this out of the way. So the attributes here, note that you can make the control disabled. Here's an example where I'm using that disable. Here, if we're not going to model tritium, then that's disabled. I can't edit it. I can still edit the technetium one. Oops, that's a big number. And then, so this control uses that first attribute where disable control if this condition is met. Include tritium switch. That's what this guy controls, is the include tritium switch. So if include tritium switch is not true, then this gets disabled. Over here, this is controlling something called source material equal column material switch. And this is then, oh, okay, that's not sufficient. Either this can, for the source, either if this is thrown, then it disappears, or if this is set to stochastic, it disappears. So I actually have this dependent on another one called override source material entry, which is a selector whose value depends on the state of this or this. So the logic can get kind of tricky. But what it does, instead of just disabling it, is it disables it and hides it. So it's hidden, and it's not just hidden from the user. It actually is not able to be seen by the mouse or any keyboard stuff or anything. So it removes it, essentially, from the dashboard. And that's kind of neat. I think that's a very neat feature of that. And here, This one only hides if it's using stochastic values. Because if we make this equal, sometimes these flyover boxes can get in the way. If we make these equal, then these disappear, but these don't. These are still numbers that you'd want to use for inputs. And you can see it says 1600 when it does that. So I thought I was kind of proud of having developed that today. And then again, we want to align them and make them all pretty. This alignment thing is one of the things I use most in GoldSim, is this alignment tool. So that's a nice dashboard trick if you want to be able to have people do different things. It's like we only lost one person so far. That's great. Not sure if this is, oh yeah, I'm building this, tables of results and stuff too. Tables of buttons to show individual results. This got a lot more complicated in GoldSim 11 because the result element changed. Oh, sorry. The result element changed, and some for the better, some things are made more difficult. But so Jason, you were talking about the tabs, and you can see here at the bottom, I have buttons that don't move around, except here's results, other results. Why do I have a results button? Oh, it takes you to the results container. Oh, there's actually another thing that Kate Catlett mentioned this morning as a nice trick. When you have results, see I have a whole container. These are all the results that are referenced from that dashboard. In a lot of cases, you want to have an expression that the result is tied to right there in the results. Rather than having this point out to somewhere out in the model, you want to have it point to something very local, even if this is just a repetition of something else that's out there. And the reason is, and this may have changed under GoldSim 11, I could check. I could check by deleting that. Let me do that. What I'm going to do is copy it, stick it over here, and then delete the original, and see. Oh, now it got lost. Oh, this whole thing may have gotten fixed in 11. Now, if I go rename that and I open this again, will it find it? No.
Well, but now
I lost the link to that.
So John,
yeah.
Double click on that, or go back to the chart properties.
Okay.
And double click on the red thing.
Yeah.
See how it's currently highlighted your copy.
Okay, so it's suggesting that maybe that's what I'm looking for.
It is, but yeah, the way that references are made now in results are quite different. It's now a reference, not a link. You know, like elements link to each other when they're. Yeah. Now it's become more of a reference, and the reason for that is so that you can change the label. Yeah. So.
And that's all good, but what happens is then the link is broken. And so to keep links from being broken when I'm out editing around in the model is I have this local expression. So here's the local expression, and it may be linked to something else out there. This one's actually a complicated one, but it might be linked to something else that's just the exact same thing. Now, what it's linked to, I can go out and delete and rename and replace with a different element type and all that, and then as long as it comes back and has the same name, when I hit F9, this will find it and link up to it. So then there are no broken links, and I don't have to go back in and edit the result element.
Yeah, if you're going to do things.
How that works?
Yeah, like so. Let's say, for example, you're going to make a copy of that time history result, and do it and paste it into another localized container. What you'd want to do is make sure that if it's going into another localized container, you want to copy it with the referenced elements.
It's its expression, yeah. So I like to keep the
Yeah.
expressions close to the result elements, and that keeps from having to rebuild result elements. And as you can see, sometimes that can be very painful. You know, when you have a couple hundred result elements. And also when we, you know, I said before that unlike regular coding, you don't generally have different people working on different parts of the model and then combine them. We actually do that sometimes. And so we might have our risk assessor develop the whole dose assessment container. And as long as he knows what he needs to reference and we know what we need to get out of his container, he can go do that. And then we can delete the old container and put his new one in it. And it has all the new stuff in it. But if we have result elements that are pointing to things in that container, all the links get broken. But if we have result elements that are pointing to local expressions that are pointing to stuff in that container, then the links don't get broken. And that's what actually gave us this idea of just always keeping an expression next to the result element. So
I see.
that's a nifty trick.
Okay.
Yeah. So back to the webinar thing. Any questions from people? I don't know. If not, I guess we'll let people go.
Let me see, John, real quick. Let me just review this. Somebody did ask, not a technical question, but I'm interested in how John got his start using GoldSim and a range of his clients.
Well, it all started with rad waste, really, which is sort of the roots of GoldSim, too. We were working on a radioactive waste problem. I live here in Los Alamos, and we had one just across the canyon there at the lab, and used RIP to write a model for it, and then rebuilt that in GoldSim. And then, you know, I'm sort of a programmer at heart, and so it was very appealing to me to have this new programming platform, and it had a lot of power for doing these performance assessments. So most of my clients now, Neptune has a much larger range of clients, but most of my work is involved in radiological performance assessment. But I also have written GoldSim models doing a lot of other things from, well, I wrote one to model epidemics, wrote one to model risk, the game, and what are the probabilities of taking Brazil that has 12 armies if you have Argentina with 20, just for fun.
Yeah, and that model's in our model library, I'd say.
Yeah, that one's in the model library.
The risk model's in the model library.
And then there's this decision model that we wrote, which is kind of new for me. And then wrote one for hydropower operations along a river in Montana to see if they could change the way they generated power to get more peak power and still provide enough water for fishies downstream and all that. So, and some other water resources type work. But mostly the GoldSim applications are in this performance assessment work. And in part that's because they become really big models. They'll have thousands of elements, and you know, they make the big ones will cost upwards of $1 million to put together. And a lot of that is in the QA and in the literature review and the research that goes behind it. And so, yeah, how I got my start into rad stuff and all that. Well, I became an environmental engineer because I wanted to be able to apply math and science and computers and fun stuff to social problems. And that, you know, everybody has a different path how they get into things.
All right, thank you. Someone did say excellent presentation, good tips, and the audio was also very good.
Okay, good.
And that was from Henning in Brisbane, Australia.
Brisbane? Very good.
So
I'd like to come down there sometime.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah, get back to Brisbane. Been to Cairns and Sydney, but breezed through Brisbane. Well, thank you for that. Appreciate it.
Yeah, and some others are just saying thank you, and they enjoyed the webinar. So
Okay.
as did I. It was very good. Thank you, John.
If people have questions later, I got my email address here up on the screen, so feel free to, I'll yak, as you can tell, I'll yak about this stuff all day. Okay, well, thanks for coming, folks.
All right, thank you, John. I'll go ahead and leave this open in case there are any follow-up questions, but it looks like people are starting to exit.